Welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Hartley. This podcast exists to equip and inspire your heart-centered leadership. Every week, we bring interviews with some of the greatest heart sets and mindsets on the planet. I hope the heartprint of our time spent together is that it creates new possibilities for you and all those you come into contact with. If you'd like to explore what we could make possible for you, then head to abty.co.uk/connect and book in a free 30-minute call to begin our journey together. I just want to express a huge amount of gratitude to our sponsors, Exhale Coffee. I have been a big fan of Exhale Coffee since meeting Alex and the team back in 2022. Exhale is the first coffee to be sourced, roasted and lab tested specifically to maximize its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory potency. An independent lab test has shown that 1 cup of Exhale Coffee has the same antioxidant power as 1.8 kilos of blueberries or 55 oranges. I'm a huge fan, and Mrs. H loves the decaf, especially because she knows that Exhale use the mountain water decaffeination process, which uses only pure glacial water from the highest mountain in Mexico and no nasty chemicals. Simply head to exhalecoffee.com/ABTY for your special offer. And lastly, before I introduce this week's guest, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It would really help us leave a greater heartprint on this world. On episode 274, what a joy it is to welcome Mac Lake to the podcast. Mac has a heart for discipling leaders. In this episode, we're going to hear all about his experience of planting a church, serving as a leadership development pastor, and now being the founder of his company Multiply Group, where he is applying his leadership principles to help companies achieve growth and leadership excellence through implementing intentional leadership development strategies. Mac is the author of 7 books, including The Multiplication Effect and the Discipling Leader series. You can find out more about Mac's approach to leadership by heading to his website, maclakeonline.com, or head to his YouTube channel. All the links that you need will be in the show notes. And here we go, is episode 274 with Mac Lake. Mac, welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. How are you, brother?
Good, Ryan. So nice to meet you, and look forward to the conversation today.
Oh, me too. It is a wild time in your country at the moment. It's a wild time. But I think we can take some comfort in the words of King Solomon, who said that there's nothing new under the sun.
Yes,
And I hope that you and I can share, or at least revel in some of the 2,000-year-old wisdom, and hopefully apply some of that in modern times.
yes. Hope so too. I was having dinner with some folks last night, and they were saying I can't stop watching the news because everything feels like first in a lifetime thing,
Yeah. Well, there's these meme that says this week on the series of America. It's just, it's a wild time. But yeah, just be honored if you'd give us a bit of an introduction into who you are and the significance of your ministry journey over the years.
Yeah, my name is Mac Lake, and I run an organization called Multiply Group. And the short story is I gave my life to Christ at 9 years old, fell madly in love with Jesus, fell madly in love with the church, dedicated my life to serving the church very early on. Went to Moody Bible Institute for my undergrad, Dallas Theological Seminary, eventually for seminary. And I have worked in churches as a youth pastor, associate pastor. I've done children's ministry. I've been a campus pastor and a multisite. I've been a leadership development pastor, planted a church. And so just have worn a lot of different hats, had a lot of different experience from a lot of different angles. And each of those angles, I found that my driving passion was leadership development. And so that's what I do now, is I help churches and organizations build intentional leadership development strategies so they can have more and better and healthy leaders. So that's what we work on.
My favorite topic, the Moody. I've never heard of Moody, but it does it reminds me. Is it Dr. Gary Chapman? Are you familiar with Dr. Gary? Was he to do with Moody?
I don't know if he
No, no,
graduated
no.
there. I'm not sure what that connection might be, but school founded by Dwight Moody, a
Right.
great evangelist, and he wanted to start a Bible college. He wanted it to be tuition free,
Mm,
and for a long time now, school's been
yeah.
around serving and providing Christian education.
Love that. Just so you know where I'm coming from, I've only been as a disciple since 2019. In fact, I was quite anti. I grew up single parent family, and the
Wow.
idea of a heavenly father just didn't really sit well with me. Earthly father relationships, and I had a Christ encounter in 2019. My heart was set on fire, and so I've been
Wow.
trying to be a good disciple since. But I think one of the things that I started to do, at least before I accepted Jesus as who he says he is, I've at least accepted him as one of the greatest leaders of all time. I think he was my gateway. I was already interested in this topic of leadership, and I love the work of Bob Goff, where he was right in the word love does, and how he talked about the character and the spirit of Jesus. And I was like, yeah, Jesus
Mm,
is a dude, man. Like, but now I'm like following him, and I have him as my king. He's
yeah.
also like a standard. He's almost like a model. Like, it's like the greatest model of leadership that I think we can follow. And this
Yeah.
podcast isn't necessarily a Christian podcast, but I can't separate my Christ followership from the conversations. So
Right.
I'm going to really enjoy diving into this conversation with you. But I guess you come to Christ at 9, which is an incredible story, and I'm sure there's a story there. But why leadership? Why did the topic of leadership really capture your imagination?
because I was such a bad leader. Yeah, and so like I said, I was madly in love with Christ and the church, but I was an extremely shy young man, and
Mm,
high and elementary and junior high school and all that. And so I struggled, and then when I did get into ministry, a group of parents approached me one day, and they said, "Mac, we love you. You're a great guy, but you're just not a leader." And they were right. I would plan some youth event. Well, I would plan the event. I would do the devotion. I would lead the worship. I would buy all the food. I did everything. I was a doer, not a leader. And they
mm,
recognized that. And so they called me out on that. And then over the years, fortunately, God intersected my life with the life of a pastor who recognized that in me, but decided to do something about it. And
mm,
so he invited me into a weekly discipleship relationship where the focus was on leadership.
mm,
And so he knew me well enough that I was mature enough in my faith that I was living like Jesus. I just wasn't leading like Jesus.
mm.
And so he began to disciple me in a way to grow me in leadership. And this is a big problem in our culture today, Christian culture today. We get satisfied with teaching people to live like Jesus, but then we don't go to that extra mile and teach them to lead like Jesus. Jesus was a phenomenal leader.
Mm,
And so that's what he did for me. And
mm,
it changed my leadership competency. It changed my leadership character, but that relationship with him changed my leadership confidence as
mm,
well.
mm,
And that's what good leadership development does. It doesn't just change your level of competency, it changes your level of confidence. And so for the first time in my life, I saw myself as a leader instead of a doer.
mm,
And unfortunately, many believers in the church and even in business today, they see themselves as doers, not as leaders. And some even I was it's interesting, Ryan. I was speaking at a conference one time, and before I got up to speak, they had three different leaders stand up and give a testimony about leading in the church. All three of them said something to this effect. Well, hey, I don't consider myself a leader, but, and they gave their testimony about leadership. The next one, well, I'm not really a leader, but,
mm,
and I stood up afterwards and I said, hey, listen, I love you guys. I mean, I appreciate your humility, but
mm,
be careful because sometimes we don't say that out of humility. We say it out of insecurity
mm,
because we've defined leadership based on culture, not based on scripture. And so when you define leadership based on what culture says leadership is, yeah, you can feel pretty insecure. I'm not a Bill Gates. I'm not a Steve Jobs. I'm not that type of leader. And that's not what we want to be. We want to lead like Jesus and define leadership biblically. And when you do that, don't shy back from calling yourself a leader. God wants you to be a leader. Jesus wants you to be a leader. He wants you to step in. He called 12 men to be apostles. The fascinating thing about that word, 400 years before Christ, that word apostle was used to speak of an admiral of a ship who would explore lands, unconquered territory on behalf of the king, find unconquered lands, go in and set up a culture reflective of the king, set up a colony, reflect the culture of the king. That's what he's calling us to do, to be culture shapers. And that's what a leader does.
I love that. I can sense your fire for it. And one of the jarring things that happens when you come to faith is that you have this internal kind of narrative, this conversation, or even a conversation with the king. And for me, it was, I'd already accept this idea of, love was the most powerful spirit to lead with, so leading with love. And I come from the UK police service. I was in the police service in a kind of management role in the back office. I wasn't a police officer, but I was doing lots of nerdy things with spreadsheets and stuff. And, I was talking about this style of leadership, leading with love. And one of the first things I had to come face to face with is the reality of my leadership is I was leading for love. Like I built a lot of success on the insecurity which you talk about. I was leading with that insecurity, needing something from my leadership, which meant that I was vulnerable. And I think the greatest gift I've been given since coming to Christ is that I've been filled. I have been filled with that with which I thought was not there. I've been healed, meaning that actually I can come with the fruits of my spirit being from love, as opposed to every act, every decision I made, I need validation or affirmation. And oh man, there's such more freedom in that style of leadership.
Yeah, there is. And so many people, I remember years ago when I was first in ministry, I was associate pastor at a church, and my pastor would give me the opportunity to preach. Excuse me. And so I would preach, and I was a young guy, and I'd stand up there and I'd preach, and I'd be scouring the crowd, looking for who was engaging. And when the service was over with, you know what I'd do? I would go to those people that were smiling. I could tell was engaged. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you this morning, because I was looking for that shot in the arm.
Yeah.
And I needed their approval. I needed their praise.
Yeah.
And it was like, I knew who my dealers were, I knew who I could get approval from. And so after services, I would go out and look for those dealers to get that shot of approval in my arm to let me know I was okay. Let me know I was good enough. Let me know I did a good job today. And that is based on insecurity.
Yeah.
And I needed my ministry to feed my identity. And that's a dangerous place to be when you need your ministry to feed your identity, because you become a consumer of your own ministry. I'm only doing the ministry because I am consuming from it what I need to fuel my identity.
Yeah.
Woo, that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, and the wonderful podcast series that you put out with your son recently, and one of the examples that was talked about was actually, spending time in the world and culture with other leaders, and you learn those ideas, but there's nothing more powerful than spending your time with Jesus. And you use this wonderful image about your leadership just being a faded photocopy. Like, tell us about that. Tell us about that image. Bring that to life for us.
Yeah. I mean, I want my relationship with Christ to be real time, vivid, filled with everything it should be filled with. Jesus goes on top of a mountain midway through his ministry, and he preaches the Sermon on the Mount. And the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it says, and the people were amazed at how Jesus taught, that he taught with such authority, not like that of the rabbis. And what the Pharisees and rabbis of that day would do is they would quote previous rabbis. Well, Rabbi so-and-so says this, and Rabbi so-and-so says this, and they would just hand those down. And Jesus didn't quote anybody.
Yeah.
He was bringing his own authority from his relationship with his Father. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he's showing them, he's saying, let me display for you. You have been taught the Torah for centuries, but you are getting this faded image of what the intent is.
Mm.
And I want to bring to full life and full color the intent of the Torah and how it is supposed to transform your life.
Mm.
It is not in the Sermon on the Mount. He's flipping everything upside down. It's not about external conformity. It's about internal transformation. I
Mm.
want you to understand the word this way, and you will be transformed. And this is what your life could look like. And so often we just feed off of other people's plates. We go to church on Sunday and we feed off the pastor's plate instead of saying, how can I engage with the Spirit of God and the Word of God on a daily basis so I'm living in full color of what He wants me to experience, and a firsthand experience with Him, hearing from Him, Him speaking to you. There's nothing like it, but many people miss that.
Yeah. And the bit I love at the end of the Sermon on the Mount is he just disappears to the mountains for a few days. Like he has enough self-awareness to know, oh, that's enough. That's enough people for now. I need to go recharge.
I'm going to go refuel. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got the self-awareness to know that he needs to go and refuel for a bit. Yeah. And
Yeah.
one of the things I know about your ministry, I think you planted your first church in the 90s, is that correct?
Yep. 1997.
So
Yes. Yeah.
you must have a family, young children, trying to navigate responsibilities at home and in the world. You know, I set this business up, 7 years ago. My eldest is 11, my youngest is 9. So right in the early days, that balance of trying to do right by the home, trying to do right by the world, trying to bring your work and your mission to the world, like that's hard. And I think having lived through that young children aspect of it, we probably have moments of, oh, that wasn't so good, but at least we get to share the learnings with the next generation of young men. I'm fortunate enough to be journeying with some young men. Go, hey, don't look to me to do what to do, just here's a few things of not what to do. But I guess, how do you reflect back on this balance of, or actually, I think some of the words that you were speaking about with Brandon in the podcast was that your home has to be your first ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. It does. And I remember when, God called us to plant the church. I never wanted to plant a church, but God just arrested my heart and called me to do it. And it was just undeniable that was what we were supposed to do. And so we announced it to our church. We said, hey, we're going to be resigning. We're going to be planting a church in Myrtle Beach. And the church was very supportive and all that. And I knew it was going to be a lot of work. I knew it was going to be hard. And but it was like the week after we announced it, Cindy and I were driving down the road and we were listening to a CD back then, listened to a CD. And the pastor on the CD said, hey, if you have young children, do not go plant a church. It was like, oh no, it's too late. We just resigned, And we had 3 young kids. Brianna was, Brandon was 6, Jordan was 3, and I think Bree was 1, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they were.
So your hands were full. You were. Life was busy.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we were driving. We heard that guy say that on that cassette, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, it's too late. We've already resigned." And we talked about it. And I looked at Cindy and I said, "You know what? Let's do this. Let's make a decision right now. If planting the church ever comes to a place where it's not fun, let's quit." And now there were plenty of times it wasn't fun.
Yes.
But what I meant was, if it ever becomes characterized and it's all of a sudden we find ourselves in a consistent place where it's wearing us down, it's robbing joy from us and robbing life from us and taking away from our family, let's just walk away. And we made that decision right up front. There were plenty of times it was hard. We didn't walk away because it was constantly filled with joy, moments of joy and miracles and all that. But the other thing we said is, let's determine now that our family will be better because of this experience. And so whether you're planting a church or starting a business or taking on any new challenge, ask yourself, hey, what can we do? How can we do this in such a way that our family will be better because of it? And we knew it was going to be risky. So we would share with the kids, hey, you guys, we're facing a challenge right now.
Mm,
Let's get together and let's pray that God will provide.
mm,
And God would provide. And then we'd look at the kids and we go, guess what? God provided. We had a box. It was the blessing box, is what we called it.
mm.
And in those years in that church plant, every time God would do some miraculous provision or something crazy, we would write on a piece of paper at dinner time,
Yeah,
share it with the kids, and they would drop it in that blessing box. And we would just put blessing after blessing of how God provided small
yeah,
things, medium size, and big things that God did in those years. And our kids, and Brandon talks about it in his concerts today. Almost every concert, he'll
yeah,
allude to those years in that church plant
yeah,
where we saw God's provision and how those miracles of faith fed his faith, even as a young boy.
yeah, yeah. But the real question is, have the grandkids taught you how to griddy yet?
They have. Now the cool thing is, last summer I just saw a picture of this flash up on my rotating, family
Yeah,
pictures.
yeah.
Last year, Kirk Cousins reached out to Brandon. He was the quarterback for the Vikings.
Mhm.
Reached out to Brandon and said, "Hey, I saw you're going to be in town for your concert. Why don't you come over to practice and Vikings practice
Yeah, nice.
and hang out with us?" And so we all went. I was with them, and we went over, and his two youngest got to go on the field, and they got to do the gritty for Justin Jefferson.
Yeah, come
He
on.
laughed his head off. It was
Yeah,
great.
yeah. Oh, it was such a blessing, isn't it? And I think so. I'm relatively new to faith, and so I didn't have a model of what faith in the home looked like.
Yeah,
And much is the case, I think for too many men, I think actually it's the wife and the woman that is more of the leader in the home these days, rightly or wrongly. That's just just how things seem to be, and dads seem to take a kind of passive role, not just with the faith, but with the raising of children as well. And I've made a real commitment to try and lead within the home and try and first make this my ministry sort of thing, to so that my the success outside of the world is never at the expense inside of the home.
yeah.
But I've never had a model, so having conversations with people like yourself and seeking some good people out of my
Mhm.
community has been life-giving. But I think what you're saying is that when you talk about apostles setting that culture, that's kind of what we're talking about here, isn't it? That
Yeah,
culture of what we do at home. It's really powerful. What tips would
yeah,
you have for any young man that's kind of journeying with a new family? Maybe they're new to faith. What are some of the one of the two simple things that they can do to start bedding that culture into their family?
yeah. Number one is you have to model faith.
Mm,
You have to model it. Recognize it is amazing. All three of my kids, they're all grown now,
mm,
but they will mention something sometimes, and I go, "Wow, you
yeah,
mean you saw that?
yeah,
You remember that?"
yeah.
And it's the small things they remember because they are watching your faith on a day-to-day basis.
Mm,
And so, be a consistent model is the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, be quick to apologize to your children.
mm,
Many people are too prideful to apologize to their children. If you do something wrong to them that's affected them, or you do something wrong and they witness it, you treat your wife wrong or something, pull your kids together and say, "Hey, listen, guys, I want to I owe you an apology.
mm, mm.
I owe you an apology." Don't just say, "Hey, I'm sorry you saw that." No.
Yeah, yeah,
Hey,
yeah,
listen, guys, sit down. Dad needs to tell you something.
yeah.
I owe you an apology right now. What the way I just spoke or the way I just acted,
Mm,
that wasn't that wasn't modeling Jesus, and I want to
mm,
model Jesus, and I didn't in that moment. And none of us are perfect, and there are times we'll mess up, but I'm sorry that I modeled the wrong thing for you,
mm.
and I promise I will try to do better. I think that goes miles. That speaks volumes when you can apologize to your kids. Third thing I would say, when you discipline your children, make sure you're don't discipline them out of a place based on your ego.
Mm.
A lot of times we discipline children because their behavior is, we take it as a reflection of our parenting. And so when you're out in public and your kids do something crazy, they act crazy, you yell at them, you slap them or whatever, don't
Mhm.
do that, because you're disciplining them out of your own ego and insecurity, because it's a
Mm,
reflect. Right now you're looking, I'm disciplining them not to shape them into how
mm.
God wants them to be. I'm disciplining them because I want to shut them down
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the reflection it is on me right now, my
Mm.
identity. And then the other thing, Ryan, that I've realized, I just want to share this. I've realized over the past few years that is really important, I think, is I didn't realize this when I was parenting. I was teaching my sons how to be a dad. Think about that. When you're
Mhm.
parenting them, you're teaching your son how to be a dad.
Yeah.
Now, when that hit me,
Yeah.
now I realize, oh, wow,
Yeah.
I'm teaching my kids now. And this, see, I have 6 grandkids. I'm teaching my kids
Yeah.
how to be a grandparent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, and so I have to ask myself, am I modeling what a grandparent should do? Am I adding faith to my grandchildren? Am I modeling Jesus for my grandchildren? Am I loving my grandchildren with unconditional love? Am I supporting the values of their parents, or am I undermining the value of their parents?
Mm.
And so I have to recognize that when I'm parenting, I'm teaching my kids to be a parent. And when I am grandparenting, I'm teaching my kids to be a grandparent.
Yeah, there's some standards there, isn't there? There's some,
Mhm.
and I think that's conscious. You know, I heard a similar thing. I was at a biohacking conference a couple of years ago, and Ben Greenfield, he turned around and said, "Parent like you're raising your grandkids." It's like, because that's exactly what's happening. You are the
Yeah.
you are the role model. You are one of the things that I've kind of you know, I really started this journey out of voice, but yesterday one of the first things I would say is you need to lead yourself. Lead yourself, lead yourself. And in the last couple of years, I've really started to go, actually, do you know what? I'm a better leader, but when I become a better follower. And that's the idea of discipleship, right? And I think one of the things I've seen you talk about is discipleship and leadership. You can't separate the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we become better disciples?
It it's learning to listen to Jesus. Jesus said, "My sheep know my voice."
Hmm.
There's a video I found on YouTube. It's amazing. There was a sheep pen with hundreds and hundreds of sheep. And these sheep were owned by different shepherds. And one shepherd walked up to the gate, opened the gate, and he started calling out.
Yeah.
I don't know what he was saying, couldn't understand it. It was a different language,
Yeah.
but he started calling out in his voice. All of a sudden, the sheep who were all interspersed, his sheep start
Wow.
coming through the gate, and the other
Yeah.
sheep totally ignore him, And we understand this because, when you're
Yeah.
like right now, I go to my grandson's ball games,
Hmm.
and they're out there, they're intense. I mean, these kids, they're athletes, they're intense, they're focused, right? And if I holler out, "Hey, way to go," I'll see them look over at me because they recognize my voice.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of parents over there and grandparents are, "Way to go, way to go." They don't look at their voice, they look at
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
voice. And so if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, learn to recognize the voice of Jesus. And then when you do that, it enables you to walk in the spirit.
Mm.
One of my life verses, Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me.
Mm.
And the life I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And so I wake up today. This is not my life. It's not me. I'm not
Mm.
living this
Mm.
life. This morning I wake up and I was like, "Hey, here's my schedule today, God. Would you use me? Would you fill me and use me?
Mm.
This podcast I'm going to do with Ryan,
Mm.
would you fill me? Would you use me? This lunch I have with this couple today, would you fill me? Would you use me?" And surrendering yourself on a daily basis,
Mm.
and just watching him use you
Mm.
is an exciting journey.
Yeah. Well, this is the inverse that Jesus invites us into in terms of the way with which he talks about leadership, because he says, the greatest will be the greatest among you will be the servant of all.
Mhm.
And I think that is a radical paradigm shift for the majority of the world in terms of leadership, but it's the fundamental core message is that your life's not about you. It's about, how can you be a blessing and a service to others. And so it's really interesting because when you do come to the world, when you talk about leadership, you will have to go, oh, well, that's servant leadership. We're talking about servant. But I think you take that out of it. There is no leadership. And I think, you know, Jesus is the ultimate example of both servant leadership, but also that sacrifice that he was willing to make for the benefit of others. And I think if you take service and sacrifice out of leadership, I'm not really sure what we've got left.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's all about serving him and serving others. And it's a principle we used to teach our kids when they were young is, consider others better than yourself. And we would always teach them this principle, be be more interested in people than making them interested in you.
Mm,
And so turn your attention on them, be interested in who they are instead of making them trying to entice them to be interested in who you are.
mm,
And, we always told our kids, I don't care what grades you make in school as long as you pass. As long as you pass, I don't care what grades you make because it's not your grades that are going to impact who you become. It is your people skills.
mm,
And I want you to get an A in people skills because that is what's going to take you further in life than anything else.
mm.
So grow your people skills and, learn what you can in school, but grow your people skills. It'll get you far.
Well, this is it. You know, life is you're not going to go very far if you without the ability to interact with fellow human beings, and I think that's kind of what it means to be the body. Is that there's bits in me that are really good that other people need, and there's bits that are really not so good in me that I like DIY. I I'm not very good at doing things around the house. Like my soft hands are testament to that. Do you know what I mean? I need other people that are good at that stuff, and I understand that
Yeah.
that is a very good visual expression of the body. But I think what one of the things that Christians do is they're almost like humbled to a fault. It's almost like self-deprecating, and I think what we're saying is that don't make people better than you and yourself less than, worse than. I think there's a humble confidence, like when you said, is that when you know you are a child of God,
Yeah.
you don't need anything, you don't lack anything, therefore you can posture your heart on other people and being of service. And I think that's a very different spirit with which we can come to this posturing on others. It's not coming from a self-abandonment kind of like, oh, because I'm not worthy.
Right.
It's because I know whose I am, I get to then focus on you. And I think it's a very different spirit when people are grounded in that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. And it's difficult for some people because we have this tendency to look at ourselves for what we are not.
Yeah.
We can judge ourselves. We can be hard on ourselves. We can be harsh on ourselves and not see ourselves through the eyes of Christ, recognizing that he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. That
Yeah.
means he is perfecting me. I am not perfect, but he is perfecting me, and he is
Yeah.
doing a work in me. And so I have to look at myself, not just for what I am, but for what he is making me to be, and view myself from that vantage point, not what I'm not, but what he's making me to be. And
Yeah.
when you look at it from that, you look at yourself from that perspective. That's not pride. That is looking and go, wow, God,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
see that in me?
Or
You
in
see
wonder.
that in me?
Yeah.
That's yeah, it's inspiring.
And I was fortunate enough to spend time with John Eldridge earlier this year, who wrote
Yeah.
Wild at Heart. And you know, one of the things he makes clear is that we have an enemy, and the enemy comes to have you divided from that vision with which you talk about that belief. And you know, we have to be on guard to not partner with the disconnection that the enemy might. Just, oh, are you sure? You know, just like the apple. Are you sure? You know, go on, just part. You know, and I think being alive and on guard, and I think that's why it's important to really journey with good people with some of this stuff. People that are uplifting and encouragers
Yeah.
and reminders and bring you back to the truth of who you are. Those people are absolute godsend. One of the things here in England is that I don't think we've got such mega churches like you guys do have in America. Like you do church, right? You do big, big church. I've never experienced anything like that. I'm just from a small town in the southwest of England. Our congregation's 500 at best, right? I know you guys do things slightly differently. And like, what sort of challenges does that face someone planting a church and growing and scaling? And let's put leadership front and center. The because you said some words at the start: strategy, intention. Like, let's just say that there's a leader, a church leader, looking to grow, scale, build this capacity and capability. Like, help us through that minefield. Where do we start?
Yeah. Unfortunately, one of the negatives of that in America is many young church planters start off with this dream of building a mega church.
Right. Yeah.
And And so they become disillusioned, and they're trying to reach 200, then they're trying to reach 500, then they're trying to reach 800, then 1200, and it's never good enough. It's never good enough. And in America, we become addicted to addition, and Jesus was all about multiplication.
Right.
And in the book of Acts, there was forced multiplication because they were just adding, and so God forced the multiplication. I wish more churches in America would adopt the vision of, hey, we're going to grow to 250 and we're going to multiply. um, in mega churches, it's easy to hide. Easy to remain anonymous. You can walk into a mega church and be unknown. You can walk in and walk out and nobody ever know your name. And then another problem with the megachurch mentality is we get content with attenders. We were not called to build attenders. We were called to make disciples. And a disciple in Jesus culture is a lot more serious than in our culture. These young men that Jesus invited to follow him were invited to give up their career and follow him full time. And they were apprentices, apprentice of a rabbi. And they were called to follow him on a daily basis and give up everything. And their goal was to know what he knew and become and be like he was.
Yeah.
And unfortunately in our country, disciple is more of a convenience. It's more of, well, I'm a Christian. Are you a disciple? Well, yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I go to church. And that's not even close to it. It's, have I surrendered everything to follow Jesus and abandoned everything to follow Jesus to become like him and take on the challenges? And I challenge people all the time. If there's not a little bit of fear in your life every once in a while, you're not growing your faith, because I know God well enough. I've walked with him since I was 9 years old, and he grows you. And then all of a sudden, you're sitting there for a little bit, and next thing you know, there's a challenge that's going to scare you, or there's a problem, disaster that you have to trust him for. And or a new opportunity, you go, oh, I can't do that. And he's constantly stretching your faith. And so if you're not fearing something every year, then your faith is probably not growing. So, and when those events happen, what do? You fall at the feet of Jesus and go, all right, you got to help me or I'm done here. Help me. What would you do? God, what would Jesus do here? Show me. I'll do it. I'll say yes, even though I'm scared to death. And that's being an apprentice of Jesus and allowing him to shape you into the person he wants you to be. But unfortunately, that many church planters, their mentality is, if I can get enough attenders to make the magazine, the rankings, to get the attention of people, that's what I'm after, versus really teaching people how to be disciples. I challenge church planters all the time. You should be, the number one metric you should be measuring is how many disciple makers you have in your church. And that's not true just for church planters. That's true for any pastor. How many disciple makers do you have? Not how many small groups, because not every small group makes disciples. How many disciple makers do you have? And then the second thing I challenge them with, in the early years especially, you should be spending a disproportionate amount of time with your disciple makers, modeling disciple making for them, so they understand it. Because most people they've been shaped by church culture, not biblical culture, biblical principle. And so if we could reshape our followers' mindset around biblical principles rather than cultural norms, it's going to change their disciple making behaviors. And that's what's got to happen.
One of the things that I think churches and the police service suffer with, when I was in the police service, if something happened in a different part of the country, to a police service, the people in the local community would just assume that they were one of the same, right? And I think most people that aren't involved in church do one of the same. They just lump the church as this one big body, and they're all, if one's bad, they're all bad, and they're all
Yeah.
corrupt, and they're all messing around with, children and things like that, and all this corrupt stuff. And I'm sure some of it goes on, and there's there's two spirits to everything, but and I think, and even a friend of the show has come out of ministry and set up a podcast which is looking at some of all the stuff underneath the surface, like exposes. It's like, wow, like for anyone on the outside, they must be looking in, going, well, that church stuff, like,
I don't want anything to do with that.
right, but isn't the
Yeah.
greatest marketing, like Jesus said, they'll know you're my followers by the way that you love people.
Yeah.
I think we always have to come back to that simplicity as well. How does a church environment, whatever we come to, how does that send people out more like love?
Yeah, I was I was meeting with a pastor yesterday, and it was funny because he was saying he's a great guy and he's got a great church, but he said, I don't even like church anymore. And we were talking about it because he was like, I want to see God show up. I
Yeah,
want to see lives change,
yeah,
and he's got a great church and great things are happening. And I love his spirit of discontent,
yeah.
because that keeps him open to what God might want to do.
Yeah.
And I was telling him, I said, it's so funny, so many churches, um, you watch what happens. Okay, so you have somebody that's never been to church before. They come to church,
Mm,
and what are they looking for? Well, they might be looking for God. They might be looking for Jesus. But they're definitely looking for, okay, I'm looking for somebody I can connect with.
mm,
I'm going to go give this thing a shot, and I know I need somebody with skin on to connect with. And
mm,
and so they're looking for some sort of connection. Well, they come to church for the first time in their life, perhaps. They walk through the door. They're nervous wreck. They're scared to death to walk through the door, and somebody stands there, good morning, good to see you today,
yeah,
and get
yeah, yeah.
about a 5-second greeting. They walk in the auditorium, and majority of the time they stand there and nobody says anything to them.
Yeah.
Service starts, there's songs going on that they've never heard. Then
Mm.
there's a sermon they hear for the first time, and there's a few more songs. And maybe in the middle of the service, turn and greet your neighbor. Hey, good morning. How are you? Good morning. How are you? Let's
Yeah.
give it another 10 seconds. And then they leave. And on the way out the door, somebody goes, hey, thanks for coming today. And give that 5 seconds. And so they have a total of 20 seconds connection time and community in an hour or 75-minute service.
Mm,
And they leave not knowing anyone or not feeling known.
mm,
And so I'm just like, if Christianity, if church is a gathering,
mm,
which is the Greek word gathering
mm,
of people who are supposed to be in community with each other,
yeah.
why do we structure experiences that structure community out of it,
Mm,
where people are not getting known
yeah.
and they're not getting to know? And
Mm,
we think somehow that the 20 seconds of greet and meet, which is the most uncomfortable thing, and many times, because you only got 20 seconds to, good morning, how are you? Yeah. How do we think that's making people connect? And then we stand up and go, hey, we'd love for you to join them with our small groups. Well, why would I join a small group? I don't know you people.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I am
yeah.
not going to somebody's home. And that scares me to death. And so that's just getting inside their mentality. How do we help them build community? Now, obviously, the best way to do it is teach your people to go out,
Mm,
build community, and
mm.
help them feel safe in that community, and then bring them into church.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But not everybody does that.
Well, and then you think back, and I know you've been studying the life of Christ, and I'd love to kind of pick your brains on some of those revelations. But he must have walked a lot of places. He must have walked, journeyed side by side with the. He must have ate food with, some of these moments that we just don't really do that often these days because we live in
Yeah.
separate homes. We got cars. We're so busy, and those are some of the most opportune moments to journey with human beings. My wife is a worship leader. You mentioned worship just a moment. I'd love this conversation to be a gift to her as well, an encouragement to her. Your son's lyric, you've got a lion inside of those lungs. Now get up and praise the Lord. I can't tell you how affirming that has been for her to sing
Mm.
at the top of her lungs. So just thank you from my family to yours for that because it's really set her up. It's just unboxed her.
Mm.
But as someone that has planted a church, what is the gift of a great worship leader? What gift do they have to bring, and what is the impact of a great worship leader?
Love that question. It's interesting. When Brandon was in high school, he started leading worship.
Mhm.
And he would say, Dad, you can come watch me play ball, but you cannot come watch me lead worship. It's too personal, and so I never did. I wouldn't go watch him lead worship
Yeah.
in the youth services, but I would sneak in the balcony during rehearsal, and I would watch rehearsal. And
Yeah.
he was not good. His voice would crack, he was off key and all that. And I would pray, and I would sit up there and I'd listen and I would pray. And not one time did I ever pray, God, help him have a good voice.
Yeah.
I only prayed, God, would you give this young man a worship spirit? Because
Mm.
there's such a difference between somebody with a worship spirit and somebody that's leading songs.
Mm.
And so over the years, I watched God give him a worship spirit.
Mm.
And you just watch him lead worship. He's worshiping. He's
Mm.
worshiping. And the gift of a great worship leader, and I love a great worship leader, because especially when I'm preaching, you get somebody leading you in worship before you go preach. They've ushered you into the presence of God, and the presence of God is so real to you in that moment
Mm.
because they've brought you there. They've ushered you to a place,
Mm.
and then from that place, I get to preach and speak what
Mm.
God's put on my heart. That's a special thing.
Mm.
Or for many people, the worship leader ushers you into a place, a positioning to now receive the word of God. And so that's one thing I would say. But the other thing I would say, we go to Seacoast Church, and the worship there is just phenomenal. I mean, the team is phenomenal. And I carry my notebook to church with me.
Mhm.
Here's why. I can't tell you, Ryan, how many times I'm sitting in worship, and all of a sudden I sit down and I grab my notebook,
Mm.
and I'm just all of a sudden writing. God is speaking to me
Mm.
during the worship, and I'm
Mm.
just writing whatever God said. I'm not saying, I know people around me are looking, what is he doing? Why is he sitting there
Mm.
taking notes during worship? That doesn't make sense. Is he not paying attention? Boy, he must not be very spiritual or whatever. But I'm sitting there taking notes because God is downloading on me
Yeah.
in the worship. And I may not hear a word the rest of
Yeah.
the service. I may not hear a word of the sermon because I am sitting here so engaged with God, because during worship, he gave me a word from him.
Mm.
And
What a
that's the
gift.
power of a worship leader.
I love that. One of the most powerful things I experienced during worship was just this image that Jesus like wrapped his arm around me and gave me a little nugget. Like, do you know what I mean? It was just an overwhelming feeling. Like my whole body was just like hot, and like it just, oh man, it's just surreal to even talk about. It was just that feeling of like just supreme loved, but he was my brother, and um,
Oh,
what a gift like
be,
that was.
it's being open to what God is saying and showing you. I was speaking at a conference this week for a denomination, and I did not know this till later, but the president of the denomination told me later on that they have been in decline,
Mm.
and they're trying to turn things around, and they're starting to a little bit. Okay. Well, I was the first speaker at this conference, and I forgot the name of the song, but they did a song, and this young lady who led worship, and it was the second song. And as soon as she said this one lyric at the beginning of the song, all of a sudden I saw a field. It was dry, hard ground with cracks. It looks like a puzzle because it's
Mm.
just so dry and
Mm.
cracked. And then I saw a few buds popping up, not many, but a few buds
Yeah.
popping up. And then as the song continued, all of a sudden I saw things growing. And what was the hard, dry ground turned into this lush white field.
Mm.
And that's what happened. That's what I saw during that song. When I walked on stage, I only had a certain amount of time to talk. But I was like,
Yeah.
guys, I have to share this with you. And I called her over to me, the worship leader, and I said, hey, I want to share a picture that came in my heart, that God gave me in my heart when you were leading that song. And I feel like this is a word for you guys as a church, as a denomination. Here's where you are, but here's where God's taking you.
Yeah.
And man, she was just resonating and receiving it. but it was God used her
Yes.
in that worship to give me a picture to share with this denomination, to give them hope and courage that he is doing something fresh and new. All that was from, I shared that for 8 minutes probably before I ever even got into my talk.
Yeah.
And, but all that was because of a worship leader.
That's powerful. You came to faith really young, and you've been journeying, you've planted church, and yet only recently you've really do an in-depth, intense study on the life of Christ. Was it is it a 3-year like study on the life of Christ? That's like proper intense, right? What did anything surprise you? Anything kind of transform your perspective? Any revelations pop out?
Absolutely. Yeah, Jesus started his public ministry in the fall of 26 AD. Uh, Ryan, is this podcast, is it something I can screen share?
Yeah, yeah,
Or I
yeah.
can,
Let's do that. Yeah.
if you want me to, I can screen share this and share it with your listeners, because seeing it
Let's do it.
might be a little bit better. And so, can you see this?
Yeah, I can see.
All right.
So for anyone
So
listening on the podcast, head to YouTube and you better see everything that Mac is sharing me.
yeah, and I can share this download with you so that
Oh,
you
thank you,
can
brother.
connect it to your listener podcast as well.
Love it.
But what you'll see here is Jesus began his ministry in 26 AD, in the fall 26 AD. What a lot of people don't realize, that when you read through the Gospels, we only see 52 days into the life of Jesus.
Mm,
That shocks so many people.
mm,
And so, what it tells me, it's not only important what Jesus did, but we need to know also when he did it.
mm,
And so, one of the things you see here is in the fall of 26, Jesus came on the scene. He was baptized, he faced his temptation, and right here he met what would be 5 of his apostles. Now, after he met them, he journeyed north with them, but they went home to Capernaum. He went home to Nazareth, and then he started his early Judean ministry.
mm.
And then 9 months later, he moved to Capernaum. And a few weeks after living in Capernaum, he went to Peter, James, Andrew, and John, and he looked at them and said, "Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." This is an invitation into discipleship. Now, what
Yeah.
blows many people away
Yeah.
is, notice that's the fall of 27 AD. It's 1 year after he met them. He invites
Yeah.
them into not a leadership role, but a
Yeah.
followership role.
Mm,
He begins to perform miracles. He tells parables. People are following him. He's discipling these men, and then 9 months later, in Luke 6, he goes up on a mountain and he prays all night long. And it says, Luke says, he calls his disciples to himself, and from among them he chose 12.
yeah.
And so there were potentially hundreds of disciples at the foot of that mountain. And Jesus prayed all night long. And the next morning, and that's the only time that Greek word is used, pray throughout the night without ceasing. Um, Only time that word is used. And the reason he's doing that is it's the most strategic decision he has made so far in his public ministry. Who am I going to
Mm,
choose to be as my leaders? And this is where he chooses some to be apostles. And then the next 6 months, right here, we don't have time to go into it.
yeah.
It is intense apprenticing.
Mm,
And then Luke 9 is 6 months later, here in the winter of 29 AD. He tells them, okay, you're ready. Go out 2 by 2 on your own and start doing what I taught you to do, and go preach the gospel. And they do that. And then the next 18 months, he does it's actually from winter 29 to spring of 30 AD,
mm,
before he sends them out to be movement makers and say, go make disciples. It's that year and a half Jesus gives his most intense sayings. Take up
mm,
your cross and follow me, unless you deny your father and mother. He predicts his death 3 times. He says, get behind me, Satan. He says, you still have
mm,
no faith, guys. He's speaking very harshly and hard to them, because this is the most intense part of his development with them. And then he
mm.
sends them out to be movement makers. And so 21 months before he selects leaders, and then 24 months of developing them before he sends them out ultimately, and he departs to heaven. And when you look at it from this perspective, you see Jesus is doing intentional leadership development to start a multiplication movement.
Yeah.
And he had to raise up the leaders that could carry that forward and be the culture shapers to advance the gospel. And we need to be modeling ourselves to do that same thing. We have not made a disciple unless our disciple makes a disciple. And if
Ooh.
the church could learn that, it is a
Yeah.
game changer. We're content to say, oh, so we got 20 people get saved. That is wonderful. I celebrate that. How many of those are becoming disciples that can make disciples? Because if somebody can't make a disciple, then they are only a half-baked disciple.
Yeah. I'm one generation away from having no disciples left.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is incredible. I mean, I could talk to you about this stuff all day long. Uh, that's it is interesting, isn't it? Because that is both intentional but also patient. Because there's a spirit of the world that says, I want you to perform now, and if you can't
Yes.
perform now, I shall not give you the leadership that you want or you think you're entitled to. There's a completely
Yes.
different spirit, and one that places the. Because here's the thing: Jesus didn't come to write no autobiography. He didn't come and write all this stuff down and go, right, there you go. I've said what I need to say. Now go do it.
Yeah.
He invited people to live and walk with him so that they may do that. And and here we are 2,000 years later, still talking about some of the things that he said and did, and it's just
Yeah.
living word, living transmission, powerful stuff. Is there anything from? I know that you've got a series of books out. Is there anything of your work that you'd like to put front and center to draw people's attention to go and get some more of the great work that you're putting out into the world?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a book series that I'm actually writing the final book in this series right now,
Mhm.
and it's called the Discipling Leaders Series.
Mhm.
I have not seen anything like it. And so, what it is, it takes the leadership pipeline:
Yeah.
lead yourself, lead others, lead leaders, lead a department, lead the organization. And I've written a book, which is a discipleship book for every level of leadership in a
Mm.
church or organization to help leaders disciple leaders in the leadership competencies they need at the various
Mm.
levels of the leadership pipeline. And those books are designed to be used basically in triads so that it can be a discipleship experience, where you take, 3 books, 4 books, and hand them out and say, hey, I'm going to take the two of you through this chapter 1. Two
Yeah.
weeks later, we're going to go through chapter 2, and I'm going to teach you to lead like Jesus by teaching you these leadership competencies. And so it's a series we see hundreds and hundreds of churches using to raise up and disciple leaders in their church. And even in the business world, I get messages every week on LinkedIn, businesses that are using it as well. So,
Yeah.
that's at multiplygroup.org,
Love that.
multiplygroup.org, or you can find them on Amazon as well. Um, and it's leading others, leading leaders, leading department, leading an organization are the titles of those books.
Love that. And this one here.
And the multiplication effect is the how to build a leadership development strategy. That's the basis. That's the foundational book that teaches you how to build a leadership pipeline in your church or in your company. And
Mm.
then other books teach you how to disciple leaders.
Love it. I've absolutely loved our conversation. Just I hope that we have many more in the future. Um, I have a word here, always better than yesterday. It's called Heartprint. And the Heartprint really represents the ripple effect, the legacy, the impact that we have on others. Mac, I just wonder whether you just take a moment just to really think about, your faith, your family,
Mm.
your ministry, your work, your books. What do you hope that your Heartprint will be?
Yeah, yeah. Years ago, I called a buddy of mine and I said, "Hey, I'm at a place in life. I'm wrestling with, what I'm doing and who I am and that sort of thing." And he said, "Fly down and spend a day with me." So I flew to Houston, spent a day with him, and he took a giant Post-it board and he spent 8 hours with me, just going through my history, going through my life mapping.
Mm.
And he boiled my life down to 2 words: multiplying multipliers. And that's God's calling on my life, to multiply multipliers, that anyone that comes within the sphere of my influence, the use of the resources I've written, the Heartprint that I want to leave is for us to impact kingdom advancement in our lifetime requires multiplication of disciples and multiplication of leaders. And so I want to use my life to turn people into multipliers who multiply more multipliers. And so that's the life mission, calling on my life. My latest book, which will come out in January 2025, is going to be, it's Leading Yourself. And chapter 1 is Living on Mission, how to write a life mission statement so that you can live your life on purpose and leave that Heartprint.
Let's go. I love that. Mac, thank you for all that you are. Thank you for all that you do. I'd be honored if you'd leave us with a final thought from your good self.
Yeah. Your first primary ministry is your family. If you're going to disciple anybody, disciple your family, disciple your children, your grandchildren, have a discipleship impact and relationship on your spouse, your extended family. But your family is your first ministry, and don't go minister to a bunch of other people and forget your family. They should see Jesus in your life more than anybody else. So that's what I'd leave you with.
No, I appreciate it, brother.
Ryan, good time with you today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Hey, my friends, thank you for making it to the end. I hope that our time spent together today has left you a little bit better than before you push play. I'd really appreciate if you just took a moment to leave a review to allow me to meet more people where they are and hopefully leave them a little bit better too. If you're curious to know how I, through Always Better Than Yesterday, can serve you, your team, your organisation, then head to alwaysbetterthanyesterday.com to connect. And while you're there, let me know 1 or 2 things that you're going to do as a result of listening to this conversation. I absolutely love hearing your thoughts, your reflections, and the things that this spark in your own heart and mind. If you want more insights from my heart and mind, I do send out short episodes on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, and again, I hope that they serve you well. I appreciate you listening. I'm Ryan Hartley, host of the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast, a podcast for heart-centered leaders just like you. Keep leading, my friends. Always love.